So I was talking to a friend of mine a while back, and he had found an old journal that he had used consistently like 20 years ago. And as we were talking, he started to tell me about how disappointed he was with his life, and he was wondering if it had all been a waste. And certainly it hadn't, I thought. But he began to present evidence against himself. He asked me to listen as he read portions from his journal, and he began to highlight the passages that sound word for word like the things that he still writes in his journal today, 20 years later. And he asked, have I changed at all? You could hear the grief in his spirit. And this led me to begin to wonder, have I changed at all? And how would I even know if I had? See, because when I look back at times when I was younger, whether it was middle school or high school or college, and people ask you about the future, we usually talk about our hopes for the circumstances of our life. Right? We talk about our future in terms of a career and the family we want. We might identify the ideal standard of living, maybe even a place where we'd like to live. But what we describe typically in our future dreams are our circumstances. When we get together for our 10, our 20, and our 30-year reunions, our circumstances are the things that we use to compare our lives to each other. Who has accomplished what? Who has achieved their goals? Who has surpassed their goals? And who's fallen short? It's easier to make superficial evaluations of the past. I have more money today than I had yesterday, or last year, or a decade ago. I have a better job today than I did a decade ago. I have a bigger house today than I did a decade ago. Therefore, I must be blessed. We measure change by measuring changes in our circumstances. But how often do we do the hard work that my friend had begun? The hard work of looking beneath these circumstances to consider who we have become and who we are becoming in the midst of changing circumstances. Right, there's a great challenge in evaluating our character. And part of it is that we rarely set out in life with any kind of aim or intention in this area. While we're busy setting life goals and dreaming about our future, we don't often consider, what kind of person do I want to become? And so I was challenged by my friend who 20 years down the road took the time to read back through his journals and to reflect on the past, not just on his circumstances, but on his character. And our passage this morning is going to challenge us to do the same, to consider whether we have changed at all, to consider even what does it mean to change. Woven into the story of Joseph, the story we considered last week, is the story of one of Joseph's brothers, another of the 12 sons of Jacob. This morning, we will meet Judah. Judah is the fourth of Jacob's 12 sons, and it becomes apparent as you get to the end of Genesis that Genesis has crafted this story not just to tell the story about Joseph, but also Judah. Judah, who is the son of Leah, while Joseph is the son of Rachel. Yoda? Wow. Judah and Joseph. And Joseph's son Ephraim will in Israel's history become the two most powerful tribes and significant tribes in Israel in later years. So this is, in one respect, an origin story. We might say that Joseph's story is clearly about God. What does God do in the midst of uncontrollable circumstances of life? Whether you're Joseph and you've been sold into slavery by your brothers, or then wrongly accused and thrown into prison, where is God when this happens to you in life? For Joseph, we learn that God is with him. God is able to preserve him and use Joseph's circumstances to sustain his people. If Joseph's story is about God, then Judah's story is about humans. Don't get me wrong, Judah's story is also about God, but God remains behind the scenes very much in this story. God doesn't jump out as the central figure in Judah's episodes, at least not visibly. Through Judah, we are invited to consider what humans do. What do people do in the midst of life's circumstances? In Judah, we get a glimpse beneath the circumstances of life. Judah gives us a peek into his heart, into his life, into his character. And Genesis gives us 4 episodes where Judah shows up and where he appears as an active character. We'll read the second episode in full in chapter 38. But the other 3 are still important for understanding who is Judah and what is he up to and what does he do. So turn with me to Genesis 37. We'll take a quick look at a verse from the first episode, our first encounter with Judah. So Genesis 37, verse 27. Judah and his brothers, at this point, have thrown Joseph into the pit, and they have decided they are going to kill him. They hate him. They can't stand their brother, and they are ready to get rid of him. And in the midst of this, Judah speaks up, and we hear Judah say something. And this is what Judah has to say to his brothers. Well, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Consider quickly the argument that Judah makes here. Judah weighs the cost. What will we gain by killing him? If we want to benefit from this in some way, why don't we just sell him instead? Notice also, Judah suggests that this action will do something else. This action will release from their hands Joseph. In other words, they will no longer be responsible for what happens to him. As long as they don't kill him themselves, if they just send him out, sell him, then we're free of him. That's the second kind of piece of the argument he makes. If it isn't then profit that appeals to any of the other brothers, Judah throws a little humanitarian reasoning in as well. And besides, he's our brother, he's our flesh, we can't kill him. Judah asks the question, what do I want? And then he does what it takes to get that. As we look to chapter 38, we're going to get an extended story about Judah that sends us spinning into the depths of who Judah is. This morning I'm going to read from the Common English Bible translation. It's a bit more natural for a narrative, and since we're going to read the whole thing, just if you're, depending on what translation you're using, that way you're aware. Hey, that sounds weird. Common English Bible. All right. At that time, Judah moved away from his brothers and settled near an Adullamite named Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her. And after he slept with her, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son, whom she named Er. She became pregnant again, gave birth to a son, and named him Onan. Then she gave birth to one more son and named him Shelah. She was in Kezib when she gave birth to him. The language used in this first couple verses to describe these events is interesting. Judah and his brothers saw their brother Joseph, and they took him in order to throw him into the pit. Before that, Eve saw the fruit, and she took it. And here too, Judah saw a Canaanite woman, and he took her. We keep reading. Judah married his oldest son Er to a woman named Tamar, but the Lord considered Judah's oldest son Er immoral, and the Lord put him to death. Judah said to Onan, "Go to your brother's wife, do your duty as her brother-in-law, and provide children for your brother." We aren't told what Er has done, but the Lord is the one who has caused Er's death. And now Onan is tasked with brother-in-law duty. This duty was to provide protection for a childless widow and to make sure that the brother's name continued by getting married to his sister-in-law. Onan is to marry her, have children with her in order to preserve his brother's name. And I won't lie and pretend that this makes any sense to me as a practice. And this is one of those places where the cultural divide between us and those in the story is great and has potential to maybe derail us from the main message of the story. But we continue reading. Onan knew the children wouldn't be his, and so he slept with his brother's wife. And so when he slept with his brother's wife, he wasted his semen on the ground, so he wouldn't give his brother children. The Lord considered what he did as wrong and put him to death too. Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Stay as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up." Again, our modern sensibilities push back, right? Onan's behavior can't be described as horribly wicked and worthy of death, can it? To us, it just appears maybe weird and probably selfish. Except this isn't a victimless crime. Onan seems more than willing to fulfill his brotherly obligations of taking Tamar as a wife and enjoying the sexual benefits of marriage, but he's not willing for it to cost him anything. Right? In this way, Onan seems to have a little bit of his father in him. What's in this for me? I will take advantage of my circumstances, this obligation, in order to gain some pleasure, but I'm not actually willing to serve my brother or our family. Judah jumps into the mix as well again, and he remains true to form. After marrying two of his sons to Tamar and both having died, it doesn't take much to notice a common denominator. Tamar. This is an easy fix. Avoid marrying your third son to Tamar at all costs. Preserve the family. We'll keep reading. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And then after a period of mourning, he and his neighbor Hira the Adullamite went to Timnah, and those who were shearing his sheep. Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is now on his way up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So Tamar took off the clothing she wore as a widow, covered herself with a veil, put on makeup, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim on the road to Timnah, since she realized that although Shelah had already grown up, she hadn't been given to him as a wife. Tamar realizes what's going on here. To be a childless widow was to be in one of the most destitute of positions in the ancient world. And it was up to Judah. It was Judah's responsibility to do right by her, to provide for her the means of her survival. But Judah can't be bothered. And so Tamar intends to force Jacob's hand. She intervenes and she sets in motion a plan. And Judah saw her and thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. He turned to her beside the road and said, "Let me sleep with you." because he didn't know she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "Well, what will you give me for sleeping with you?" He said, "I will give you a kid goat for my flock." She said, "Only if you give me some deposit as security to guarantee that you will send it." He said, "What kind of deposit should I give you?" And she said, "Your seal, its cord, and the staff in your hand." And he gave these to her, slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. Then she got up, left, and took off her veil, dressing once again in the clothing she wore as a widow. Judah sent the kid goat with his neighbor, the Adullamite, so he could take back the deposits from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He asked the locals of that place, "Where's the consecrated worker who was at Anaim on the road?" But they said, "There's no consecrated worker here." So he went back to Judah and said, "I couldn't find her." The locals even said, "There's no consecrated woman here." Judah said, "Let her keep everything so we aren't laughed at. I did send this kid goat, but you couldn't find her." Judah has returned to take care of his part of the transaction, and he comes ready to pay the fee, but when she can't be found, it's not really worth the effort to find her. His reputation is at stake, and it's easier to just drop it. Until about 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has become a prostitute and is now pregnant because of it." And Judah said, "Bring her out here so she may be burned." Judah protected his family by keeping Shelah from marrying Tamar. Judah then protected his own reputation by not pushing the matter and trying to get his stuff back. And now Judah will protect his family's reputation by punishing this shameful daughter-in-law. When she was brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law: "I'm pregnant by the man who owns these things. See if you recognize whose seal, cord, and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She's more righteous than I am, because I didn't allow her to marry my son, Shelah." Judah never knew her intimately again. Judah is confronted with his actions. He is ready to bring judgment down on Tamar when her shrewd plan comes to a head. And Judah is the one whose sin has been revealed. If you've ever found yourself standing naked in your sin, exposed, uncovered, you know that the next step isn't easy. There's always a decision to make, right? Do you own your sin, confessing it and naming it? Or do you desperately scramble to try to begin covering it up? And here, at this place in the story, for the very first time in either of the first two episodes with Judah in them, we find him actually taking responsibility for something, anything. Judah declares that whatever Tamar has done, it pales in comparison to what he himself has done. He has greatly wronged her by not providing for her. His injustice against her has resulted in his own unrighteousness, and he owns that. See, God chose Abraham and Abraham's family so that they might keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. This is what we hear God say in chapter 18 of Genesis. This is his purpose for calling them. This is what Abraham's family has been called to do and to be. And when Judah refuses to deal justly with his daughter-in-law, he reveals himself to be inwardly where he is geographically. Remember the beginning of Judah's story. It opened with him leaving and turning aside from his family. Judah has made a break with his family, with his tradition, and with apparently his God. Judah has demonstrated that this break with his family runs deeper than just a move to another town. Now, Judah confesses his injustice. He confesses his unrighteousness. And confession of sin is important. But 20 years can go by and your journal can be filled with the same confessions over and over again. And so this story leaves us wondering, what happens to Judah? Does he turn from his ways? Does Judah change at all? The story of Judah and Tamar ends without an answer. We get at the end of the story some genealogical information that on one hand shocks and on the other hand intrigues. If you know where the story goes, then the names that get mentioned at the end of the story remind us of who our God is and what our God is capable of doing. That God will ultimately bring good from the decisions that Judah and Tamar have made. That God will bring forth a man named Boaz from this family. That God will later bring forth a man named David from this family. That God will give the world his very own son through this family formed from this unholy union between Judah and his daughter-in-law. God is indeed able to work all things together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. Judah has been called according to God's purposes. But does he love God? Genesis never tells us, at least outright. What Genesis does is it keeps telling us the story of Joseph. We jump right back into the Joseph story. But in doing so, the story brings Judah into the story at decisive, there's the word, moments. Moments where Judah has a choice. Judah can be his old self, or he can be something else entirely. And so the next time we hear from Judah or any of his brothers, what we discover seems to be a positive move. They are back together. Perhaps Judah is the prodigal son, having returned home geographically. But has he changed? Plenty of us have experienced a geographical move, a change in scenery. We've moved somewhere. We've escaped a place, hoping to start a new life, but we quickly learn that new geography isn't the same as a new heart. Judah has rejoined his family, but has he rejoined God's purposes? We wonder as the story unfolds. And the final two scenes where Judah speaks up make the case that Judah has indeed become a new man. Change is at work inside of him, and it's bursting out in his life and in his actions. Remember back, Judah sought a prophet, and he sought to have clean hands when he sold his brother into slavery. But as we come into chapter 43, he offers now to take on full responsibility for his youngest half-brother. Judah, the man who didn't want his brother's blood on his hands and who wouldn't take responsibility for Tamar, now claims complete responsibility for the life and the well-being of another. But we all know that talk is cheap, and all he has done is say to his father, yeah, I will do this. I will take my brother upon myself. What does Judah do then when his half-brother's life is actually threatened? In chapter 44, the answer comes. His youngest brother is falsely accused, and Judah begins to intercede on his behalf. He steps forward and begins to plead his brother's case. But there's something else that happens in Judah's speech. In this moment, he begins to recognize that all of this is about something else, something deeper. And he begins to confess his guilt again. But this time it's the guilt that he and his brothers hold for what they did to Joseph so many years ago. See, Judah had rationalized their sin against Joseph. Because they didn't kill him, surely they weren't guilty. But they were. They had wronged him. They acted unjustly, and they had failed to walk as Abraham in the ways of the Lord, doing righteousness and justice. And Judah is able to see this now. And he confesses this, his deepest and his darkest sin. But where the real change is seen is in Judah's commitment to his word now. And he says this, "For I became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father. Now therefore, please let me remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers." This is beautiful in the story. Judah has just offered his life for another. He gives himself willingly as a substitute for the unjust punishment that his brother is facing. There is no upside for Judah in prison. There's no benefit or profit for Judah in this equation. There is only complete and utter self-giving love and generosity. The story that started with Judah selfishly selling his brother ends with Judah selflessly trading his life for his brother. Judah has become a new man. Judah does indeed love God and has been called according to his purposes. And Judah's character is now being shown off. It's radiating from him. But this isn't actually Judah's character. It's God's character. It is the character of God who is able to form in a person humble enough to confess their sin and bold enough to turn around and change directions. And yet, even humility and courage are gifts. Grace from God. Grace. Isn't this the story of our faith? That God would offer his own son in our place on our behalf, freeing us from the just penalties of our sins, cleansing us from all unrighteousness, setting us free from the power of sin and death so that we might be his people, his children, and like Judah, be transformed by God's holy love in order that we too might begin to offer ourselves freely for others. This is the story of our lives and of our faith. And I want you to do me a favor. Would you pull out your sermon notes, or would you pull out something that you could write on? And would you just write the question, have I changed at all? And will you take the remaining moments of our time in worship to offer that question to God as an act of worship? Would you keep this question before you as we leave here and as you live your life? And if you're not quite sure how to answer the question, let me point you to Jesus. Maybe this helps. To what degree is your life being given away to the extent that Jesus gave his life away? Not just in his death, but in his living. In his living, Jesus was constantly giving his life away for others. In what ways have you moved from a selfishness, a self-orientation, to a selflessness and others orientation? Where are you at today in this journey? How about in comparison with some point in the past, have you maintained your walk with God, the one who sustains you? Or have you neglected your first love, your call? And I ask you to do this, I guess, for yourselves more than me. But will you not just consider this question today and this week? Will you talk about it with someone else? I would love to talk with you about this and share with you my own answers. Derek would as well. Your small group leader would love to have this conversation with you. A board member would love to talk to you about this. Someone else in your small group, anybody in this room. These are the kinds of things that as we begin to talk about together, help us as we attempt to help each other aim our lives fully and faithfully toward Jesus.